How to have it. There we go. I was saying, on behalf of our staff and volunteers, welcome to the Schomburg Center. It's my pleasure to greet you for this special in-person edition of our series, Conversations in Black Freedom Studies. I want to thank all of the presenters who are here tonight who gave up their time to bring us some very special knowledge. And I want to thank the co-curators of Conversations in Black Freedom Studies, scholars Jean Theo-Harris and Robin Spencer-Antoine. Black freedom studies at this moment in time is all the more essential due to the very real threats to Black and brown people and to the sharing of our history, culture, and lived experiences. There are many roles for us to play: voting advocacy, both local and national, fighting against book bans and curricula censorship, and using the truth of our history to inform and to teach. This fall, Schomburg Center has launched a new initiative, Learning with Primary Sources, the Schomburg Curriculum. In collaboration with the New York Public Library Center for Educators and Schools, funded by IMLS, and IMLS is the Institute for Museum and Library Services, we developed free, anti-racist teaching resources featuring archival materials from the Schomburg collection. Though designed for teachers of middle school and high school students, these lessons can also be used for out-of-school programs, after-school programs, and for parents eager to homeschool. The curriculum is focused on three very broad themes: Black power, slavery and abolition, and coming soon, Black women's stories. The first 4 of what will be at least 15 high-quality lessons are available now to download. If you use the QR code on the screen, it'll take you to the Schomburg curriculum page, and you can download free materials already available. As we begin tonight's program, now is a good time to please silence your cell phones. During the program, I ask that you please not use flash photography and that you're not filming. During the program, it does disturb folks around you, and it does disturb folks on stage. Please join me in welcoming one of the co-curators of Conversations in Black Freedom Studies, Professor Jean Theo-Harris. Please.
Good evening. It is so wonderful to be here, to be in the building for this conversation. This is our 12th season of Conversations in Black Freedom Studies. Kamosi Woodard and I started Conversations in Black Freedom Studies in collaboration with the Schomburg Center 12 years ago to create a space where the public could engage with new works in Black social movement history. 4 years ago, Robin Spencer-Antoine joined the team, and Kamosi has taken a more emeritus status. With fewer and fewer public spaces to engage with new work in Black history, Conversations in Black Freedom Studies hopes to be a way to hear, learn, and discuss new work in Black history that helps us see the present and where we are today more clearly. We are so pleased and honored that the Schomburg Center has continued the series as one of its educational and public programming offerings. We are grateful to Casey Matthews and Joy Bivens at the Schomburg for their support, vision, and work, to Park Boulevard for helming the tech tonight, and to Lucien Baskin, who is our outreach and social media coordinator for the series. Our next program is back online, so Conversations is now kind of sometimes in person and sometimes online, so we're back online. We're always here the first Thursday of the month. But next month, November 7th, we'll be online for a conversation on Black history, anti-colonialism, and global revolutions with Natanya Duncan, Monique Badas, Keto Swan, and Paula Marie Seniors. This is a special conversation tonight. In 2015, Kamosi and I got an NEH grant to do a summer faculty seminar on the Jim Crow North. And we had 16 scholars from all over the country come and work together and think together and workshop papers and books together. And you're going to hear from 4 of those scholars tonight. And we were based both at Sarah Lawrence College and at the Schomburg Center. And I think one of the other things that the Schomburg Center does, everyone on stage tonight has used the archival offerings of the Schomburg, but also the Schomburg is a place where these kinds of intellectual symposium and collaborations can take place. Next year is the 100th anniversary of the Schomburg Center. So we are so very pleased to be having this Jim Crow North panel here in person tonight, and also so grateful that the Schomburg continues to be such a resource in this community. So let me turn it over to you, Robin.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening, everyone. I'm so happy to see everyone here. Thank you for coming out and lending us your ear. And to everyone online, welcome to our conversation. As we look at the struggles that have been part of the Black freedom movement, as we spotlight students, activists, organizers, it's important that we have this urgent conversation, launching our season and continuing our momentum as we focus on elements of the Black freedom movement. Our authors this evening will provide a critical analysis. They will share visuals from their research, and they will give us all food for thought. Our goal in conversations has been, from its beginning, to give us the history that we need, not just to understand the past, but to see a way forward. I'm delighted and honored to introduce tonight's panelists and welcome everyone to dive more deeply into their written work, including the books that they will talk about tonight. Dr. Say Burgin is an assistant professor of history at Dickinson College and the author of Organizing Your Own, The White Fight for Black Power in Detroit. Dr. Shannon King is associate professor of history at Fairfield University and the author of The Politics of Safety, The Black Struggle for Police Accountability in LaGuardia's New York. Dr. Laura Warren Hill is associate professor of human development at SUNY Binghamton and the author of Strike the Hammer, The Black Freedom Struggle in Rochester, New York, from 1940 to 1970. And Dr. Ujju Aggarwal is assistant professor of anthropology and experiential learning at the New School for Social Research and the author of Unsettling Choice, Race, Rights, and the Partitioning of Public Education.
Yeah, now my mic's on. So we wanted to start where you started, which is for each of you to tell us briefly how you came to this topic, what concerns, commitments, experiences guided your work, and particularly to this book. And Shannon, let's start with you.
Good evening. Good evening. I'm excited to participate in the Conversations in Black Freedom Struggle series with my co-panelists from the NEH Summer Seminar in 2015. And want to thank Drs. Jean Theo Harris, Robin Spencer Anton, and of course, the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, where I wrote most of my first book and have been using since my teenage years. As I was doing research about the Harlem Riot of 1935, which was supposed to be the last chapter of my first book, I came across a story about a group of youth killing a white teenager in Central Park in 1941. The newspaper articles, especially the New York Times, criminalized the black kids, and when I read Mayor Fiorello H. LaGuardia records, I found letters from white New Yorkers, not only responding to the incident in Central Park, but also the presence of black youth in their neighborhoods, parks, and other public places. As a result of this, the LaGuardia and Police Commissioner Louis Valentine expanded the police presence in the park and Harlem, especially areas bordering black and white neighborhoods. The more I read, the more I began to think about the Exonerated Five and the same way the mainstream press criminalized the black and brown youth in the 1980s and 1990s. Although I decided not to include the uprising in that book, I continue to think more about the Central Park case, as well as the roles of the mayor, the police, the media, and white citizens in the construction of crime, and thereby crime policy in the city, as well as how Black New Yorkers experienced and responded to violence, either from acts of crime or the police. In this way, the politics of safety is about Black activism against police brutality and for equitable policing in the 1930s and 1940s.
Yeah, say.
Sure. Thank you all for being here. Thank you to Robin and Jean. I'm really happy to be with all of you tonight. For me, organizing your own started with a problem. It started with the myth that the Black Power movement was anti-white. And one of the ways that I really forced myself to do this book was by teaching activist students. So how I teach the Black Power movement is really through the mythologies that surround it, right? So the idea that it was sort of helplessly violent, that it was incredibly macho, that it was this serious break with the civil rights movement, and then always the idea that it was somehow anti-white, that its sort of original sin was kicking white people out of the movement. And I would teach students about these myths, and my activist students would always say, you know, that's how they talk about us. They talk about the movement for Black lives as an anti-white drive. And where are the books that talk about this with Black power? And I was like, well, I don't know, you know? And they really pushed me to sort of see the importance of pushing back against that myth in particular. And so the book really tries to take on this myth that really surrounds the history of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which is a Southern organization, right, with a lot of branches in the North. But the myth really holds, it really kind of came of age around the idea that SNCC kicked all those nice white kids out of the movement in the South, right? And I am a historian of the North and of Detroit in particular, and I knew that Detroit had a story that was really different from that SNCC narrative, and that really helped us to sort of see a very different Black Power movement. That Black Power was actually about inviting white people into the racial justice struggle by asking them to organize against racism in white communities. And Detroit became this really, really beautiful case study for me to be able to show that.
Yeah, Laura.
Sure. It is such an honor to return to this stage, and it is incredibly humbling always to be here, and especially with this group of people that I've spent so much time with over the last decade. I was born and raised in upstate New York in a town of fewer than 1,000 people, and it was all but entirely white. And throughout my entire public schooling, after my K-12 education, I attended all SUNY schools. I had not learned one thing about the 20th century Black freedom struggle in the North. We had, of course, learned about the 18th and 19th centuries, primarily the Underground Railroad, which of course promoted narratives of white beneficence. One of the houses in my tiny town was even rumored to have been part of it. As an undergraduate, I studied with a scholar of the civil rights movement who was raised in Mississippi, and her work was focused there, though she did often note that there was a great deal to be learned about upstate New York still. In 2003, more than 20 years ago now, Jean Theo Harris and Kamosi Woodard published Freedom North, and it changed my intellectual and personal life. I had finished my master's degree, become disillusioned with the academy, and I was working in the New York State prison system doing HIV educational sessions, counseling, and testing when that book was published. No longer compelled to read academic texts for classes, I purchased the book on my own. And having done so, I started to ask questions about the organizations with which I was then working. Freedom North encouraged me to think about their history. 5 years on, I was a new mom, and I was enrolled in a doctoral program seeking a dissertation project. True to form, that same undergraduate advisor pointed me towards Rochester, New York. And given the work that Jean and Kamosi and others had done, I was able to readily justify writing about the Black freedom struggle in this northern outpost. In 1964, Rochester experienced one of the decade's first uprisings, just weeks after Harlem. But while Harlem had engaged in periodic rebellions, Rochester most certainly had not. Rochester was considered part of the fabled promised land of the 18th and 19th centuries, home to Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman. The city simultaneously enjoyed a reputation as a bastion of women's and labor rights, home to notables such as Susan B. Anthony and Emma Goldman, among others. Yet in 1964, the uprising rocked the city and, frankly, the nation. How, I wanted to know, had Rochester found itself in this racial crisis in the mid-20th century? And how had the Black community, known for its national leadership on questions of justice, get erased and or vilified in local lore? How was it possible that this city could at once contain such prosperity and well-being and harbor such racial hostility and brutality? I wanted to better understand why that event occurred, and I wanted to show how the community understood it in this period.
Thank you. Yeah.
So it is, as Laura said, such an honor to be here today, especially in the series that you all host, which has made such an imprint on my work, and really wonderful to be joining again together with, say, Laura and Shannon. So how I came to this topic. I had been working for many years as a community organizer, and a lot of this work focused on building an organization together with others called the Center for Immigrant Families, a collectively run, community-based popular education center of Black, Latinx, and other poor and working class immigrant women of color and community members in a neighborhood that's not too far from here called Manhattan Valley. As our organizing grew, we focused more and more on the intersection between school choice, gentrification, and school segregation. And my own research later would pick up on some of the contradictions we encountered in this work. At the time, the combination of mayoral control, which many here might recall had brought sweeps of school closings to Black and brown neighborhoods, including but not limited to Harlem, as well as the rapid expansion of charter schools, made it seem to many that the problem we needed to fight was privatization of public education. And that wasn't untrue. But it also didn't fit with people's experiences. That is, we found that many of the same characteristics, a competitive and opaque landscape of admissions, uneven access, a limited ability to assert one's rights to entitlements or services, that define the private also seem to characterize the public schools. So one of the things I focus on is in the book is the idea of choice and how it can expand how we think about neoliberal restructuring or the capaciousness of it. That includes but also exceeds privatization as a counterinsurgent response to Black freedom struggles, and also makes clear not just the public we need to protect, but also the public we have yet to win. So while there's no doubt that we need to defend public education as one of the last remaining public infrastructures we have in the United States, as Du Bois teaches us, and as we discussed during the seminar that you all ran, we also have to radically transform how and what we imagine the public to be.
Thank you, thank you. Those are such thoughtful responses. I wanted to invite you to take on your role as educators and teach us something. Bring us into the world of your work. Give us a window into the book and into the major interventions that you are trying to make into the larger literature of the Black freedom movement, and even to how ordinary people think about it, how they imagine a future that is a little more just, a lot more just, actually. So I want to invite you to the podium, and I wanted to start with Say.
Now you're all going to see how flappy I really am when I talk and stuff. So my book tries to answer two questions. The first is, how did Black freedom activists get to a point where they were asking white people to stop organizing in Black communities and to go into white communities and organize against racism there? And the second question is, what did white people do, right? When they sort of heard that call, when they believed in that call, what did they do? How did they do that organizing? And what the story I kind of want to share tonight is really about that first question. So like I mentioned, a lot of the mythology around that anti-white narrative, right, comes out of the South. It comes out of Stokely Carmichael's calls in 1966 for Black Power. It comes out of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. But again, I'm a student of Detroit, and so I wanted to sort of look for answers to my question there, if I could. Could I get the next slide, please? So in looking at Detroit, there is a SNCC office in Detroit, but one of the sort of more important movers and shakers in the city in the early 1960s in terms of Northern Jim Crow was SNCC's sister organization, which was known as the Northern Student Movement. The Northern Student Movement gets its start in about 1961, 62, by interracial college students, mostly out of New England. It's run at first by an interracial couple, the Countrymans, who end up living in Yale, or around Yale. I forget where Yale is, sorry. Where's Yale? There it is, New Haven, guys, just in. So they're living out of New Haven. They set up an office there. There's offices in Boston and New York and other places, and there's a really strong office in Detroit. And Detroit starts like a lot of the other chapters do. It starts with tutoring projects for children, right? But in the mid-1960s, there are a lot of changes going on in NSM. They get their very first African-American leader, Bill Strickland, who sadly left us this year. And under Bill's leadership, there are a lot of changes going on, including a move towards community organizing. And in Detroit, the group that really takes on the community organizing for the Northern Student Movement is the Adult Community Movement for Equality, or ACME, which pictures are there on the left-hand side. And ACME does community organizing on the east side of Detroit in a number of issues, sort of the racism of the welfare offices, education, but really their big issue is police brutality. And throughout 1964, ACME and NSM nationally decide that they're going to try a big-scale project that they call the Michigan Summer Project. It's based, of course, on SNCC's Mississippi Freedom Summer. And what they want to do is they want to do community organizing around the issue of police brutality to show how police brutality is the linchpin of Northern racism. And so they set out in 1964 and 1965 to do this. As they start doing this, they're having conversations about how limited interracial organizing is. And this is one of the main interventions that I want to make. We tend to have these kumbaya ideas about how interracial organizing goes, right? That it's peaceful, that people become really close friends, and that it's this sort of romantic idea of organizing. But people are having a lot of conversations about the dangers it poses, the way it increases violence from communities and from the police, and all kinds of other problems that come with interracial organizing. And as they start to plan the Michigan Freedom Summer, they decide they're going to do what I call racially parallel organizing, which is to say that African American activists are going to work to shore up political power in Black communities in Detroit, and white activists are going to work in the white communities to get white communities to support those Black-led efforts. So as they're doing this, their plans get completely derailed. They don't end up doing the Michigan Freedom Summer. Because what happens is in March of 1965, a young Black man named John Christian is shot and killed by a white shopkeeper. The Azam's businesses are run by the Azam family on the east side. And in a matter of a few years, the Azam family members have shot 3 different Black people in the city of Detroit. John Christian is the third, right? And the community response around John Christian's killing is widespread, and it's really powerful. And NSM and ACME throw themselves into this kind of organizing, right? So these are the photos that you'll see on the right-hand side of the screen there, right? So a lot of that organizing is about protesting at the shop because the prosecutors refuse to bring charges against the Azams, and it's about trying to get the public to boycott that shop, right? Now, they're somewhat successful. They manage to shut down the shop, but the prosecutor continues to refuse to bring any charges. And in the summer of 1965, the movement is this crucible, right? Tensions are really high. The state has really rained down on these activists. They've arrested dozens of people. They've held them pre-trial on really high bails. They've whipped up hysteria around these activists. And so what NSM decides to do in this sort of crucible sort of situation is to really make it a policy. They decide as a measure of safety and as a measure of tactic that they want to ask white people to go into white communities and organize against racism there, right? And that this racialized division of labor will bring a kind of measure of safety for the Black activists involved. So that's exactly what they do. And in Detroit, white activists break off and they form a group that eventually becomes known as People Against Racism. And Detroit really sets a model. It gets to this organizing before SNCC does. They're doing this sort of racially parallel organizing before Stokely Carmichael stands on a Greenwood stage in 1966 and shouts Black Power, right? And they're doing this organizing in ways that sets it up as a model for people around the country and in Detroit. So throughout the 1960s and the early 1970s, there isn't a single radical Black organization, with the exception of the Republic of New Africa, that doesn't have a white parallel in Detroit. And Detroit becomes the kind of model, I argue, for a lot of the rest of the country.
She's good. I don't trust myself without a script. So I'll start by saying that it's difficult to talk about Rochester in 8 minutes. People know a little something about places like New York City and Detroit. They don't often have much background knowledge about a place like Rochester. So my goal here tonight will be to introduce you, if you have not already been, to this city of struggle. And while I want to tell you a little something about this book and Rochester's history, I also want to connect a key theme of this work, the struggle against police brutality and violence, to the current work that I'm undertaking with a team of scholar activists in an organization called the Upstate New York Policing Research Consortium, or UNIPERC. Civil rights folks like their acronyms. In case the 8 minutes gets away from me, I want to sum up my remarks now. By quoting a C.L.R. James text. In 1938, he wrote, "They fought, they suffered, they are still fighting." As I noted previously, Rochester was considered part of the fabled Promised Land, so I wanted to better understand how had we arrived at rebellion in 1964. While Rochester was known for its high-tech lens industries, Kodak, Xerox, and Bosch & Lomb were all headquartered there, the counties located around the city generate a significant portion of the nation's produce. During World War II and its attendant labor crisis, African American agricultural workers from the South were recruited to this region. Eventually, forming the East Coast migrant stream, family groups and individuals would travel from locations such as Sanford, Florida, to the greater Rochester area to harvest apples, cherries, and celery. They took jobs in the nearby canning and fertilizer factories, and they looked for better opportunities for their families. Once acquainted with the area, many of them settled out of the migrant stream, remaining in Rochester permanently. They fought for a better life. In this way, Rochester's Black population grew from just over 3,000 people in 1940 to nearly 50,000 by 1970. For its part, Rochester was not happy to have them. Their arrival sharpened the existing racial divide, as Black newcomers were rigidly segregated into 2 city wards long home to immigrant communities. Once crowded into these two wards, the overpopulation strained the housing stock and civic resources. The result was predictable. Rather than ameliorating conditions, the city increased its policing of these wards. Several high-profile cases of police brutality ignited community organizing efforts. The 1962 Rufus Fairwell case, which I write about in the book, drew the attention of the Justice Department and one of several that prompted mass organizing and collaboration among different organizations and groups. When the entire male population of the Nation of Islam was arrested at a religious meeting by police and firefighters who barged in claiming they saw a man with a gun, the community saw another violation of the Black community. Would the police interrupt a white religious service in the same ways, they asked? Shortly thereafter, an NAACP gathering called to address the rampant police brutality in the community attracted more than 600 guests, including Malcolm X.
Such NAACP NOI collaboration was rare, and it quickly drew the ire of the national NAACP. But Black Rochester ignored their concerns in favor of a united front. Such momentum in Rochester spurred the creation of the Citizen Review Board to hear complaints made against the police. Across the nation, this CRB was only the second of its kind. Though a rather small and Pyrrhic victory in its ultimate execution, the book details the incredible organizing effort that took place before the 1964 uprising to address the violently racialized policing under which they suffered. Despite the community's best efforts over the past 60 years, police violence continues unabated in Rochester. I hope to have a moment at the end to return to this. In 1964, then, the uprising was triggered by an incident of police overreach when they brought dogs to a community event to arrest a drunk man, which incited credible rumors of police violence throughout the community. The uprising responded to years of frustration. Black Rochester was tired of begging and pleading for their rights, tired of being harassed, beaten, and killed by the police, tired of being turned down for jobs, and tired of overcrowded living in blighted neighborhoods. The uprising was a community response to such conditions. One of the key interventions my research makes in the literature is to challenge the notion that young men in a state of youthful arrogance and impatience drove the so-called riots during this era, a line of reasoning meant to dismiss the legitimate and widely shared dissatisfaction with conditions. In Rochester, this simply wasn't the case. Young and old, men and women alike demonstrated their discontent. This particular event lasted 3 days. The National Guard was called in, and the greatest damage was to property, particularly to those businesses which had engaged in unscrupulous practices, selling alcohol and rotting produce and meat on credit at rates which could never be paid off. In the immediate aftermath of the uprising, there were significant efforts to explain what transpired. A media campaign expressed city leaders' dismay and shock that an event akin to Harlem could happen in Rochester. In short, the Black community was vilified and pathologized. And national outlets from the New York Times to Business Weekly picked up the call, and those stories were reproduced in local publications across the nation. If Rochester, where else, they asked. Black Rochester seized the moment, using the publicity and the fear generated by the uprising to accelerate its organizing efforts. After an aborted attempt to work with Martin Luther King Jr.'s Southern Christian Leadership Conference, Saul Alinsky and his Industrial Areas Foundation came to town from Chicago. For his part, Alinsky only agreed to come if the Black community approved, and in the last analysis, they did. Subsequently, FIGHT, a decidedly Black power organization, formed. This was no ordinary organization. You couldn't just come in off the street and join. Instead, FIGHT, an acronym for Freedom, Integration, God, Honor, Today, the I was later changed from integration to independence, was a highly structured organization of organizations producing numerous leadership bodies. In this manner, smaller representative groups could form, meet, discuss their issues, organize around them, and then bring them to FIGHT. This promoted leadership skills within the member constituencies and empowered them to name the issues they faced. Having done this, their concerns would then go to the appropriate FIGHT committee for action from the larger umbrella organization. Thus, their power was magnified through unity. Over the subsequent decade, FIGHT would continue to raise the alarm around police brutality, but their real successes were economic. They challenged slumlords in the streets and the courts to repair the code violations that permeated the dilapidated housing in which they were forced to live. They would demand and win hiring concessions from Eastman Kodak by adopting a proxy strategy first considered by the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. They bought a few shares of Kodak stock and then asked individuals, organizations, and churches across the country to lend FIGHT their voting proxy at the annual shareholders meeting. Doing so provided FIGHT the opportunity to challenge the company's racist hiring practices in front of their shareholders. Their subsequent victory resulted in the hiring of 600 Black Rochesterians into entry-level positions. FIGHT also worked with Xerox to create one of the nation's first Black-owned community development corporations, designed to train, provide skills, and employment to those least able to secure it. Black capitalism owes a great deal to this northern city, but there is still much work to be done. They fought, they suffered, they are still fighting.
So I want to begin again by just saying that the space you all convened was so important to me to help locate how the struggles we faced in our organizing day to day were part of a much larger arc of Black freedom struggles that had long pushed back against individual choice, as well as a false distinction of de facto versus de jure segregation, calling out the violence embedded in Northern liberalism. Rooting here was important to understanding how choice worked as a strategy of enclosure in the post-Brown period to structure rights as individual private choices grounded in the right to exclude, which, as Cheryl Harris, critical race studies scholar Cheryl Harris teaches us, has been the consistent nucleus of private property and whiteness, and also confirming that the scale of the individual came to be the quote-unquote moral unit of political life, often obscuring the bold and expansive visions that grounded the movements that won such rights in the first place. Or, as a woman from the Head Start Center who I accompanied in my research put it clearly, not only was it not easy making all these choices, but also choice was false. It was a setup. So one of the things I do in this book is map this setup of choice and what we can learn from how it lives, what it does, and what it came to mean to different people in one particular time, place, and context, but also extending beyond these specifics. So I look at how choice created a context in which unintended neighbors came to encounter one another to negotiate a shared public resource in the face of an economic crisis and austerity measures of the Great Recession, and the meaning that was made of these encounters. I find that for some, choice was narrated as, quote, saving public schools and mobilized as a strategy to attract new families who otherwise were not attending or considering public schools, thereby expanding donor bases and fighting the onslaught of budget cuts and school closings. For others during this time, public schools represented an idea of novelty, often articulated as taking a chance or, quote unquote, hedging one's bets, knowing that there was still an exit plan back to the private. Adding to this mix was a vocal group of parents who took what they understood to be a progressive stand against privatization, and yet who also stood on the side of school choice policies in non-charter public schools, defending their right to choose what was best for their child. Still others migrating to public schools understood it as a question of getting in on the ground, of investing in these hidden finds, or as one policy expert put it, quote unquote, value-added stocks that had not yet been discovered, referencing schools that were on the way up, where the potential or predicted value was not yet evident or marked by test scores or other rating systems, to anticipate the future value of places that had been long marked by racialized state divestment. And yet for most Black and brown, poor and working class families, choice did not indicate novelty, but rather intensified and structured precarity and encroachment. That is, as one longtime resident put it, public schools represented, quote, the last of it, those places that had been long indicative of organized abandonment as well as struggle that remained for those who had managed to stay across and through waves of gentrification. For others, the expansion of choice policies and programs in public schools marked an increasingly violent appropriation, mobilizing the language of diversity to push forward measures that worked through and against histories of divestment that only seemed to work to extract, structured as conditional inclusion for some who were deemed appropriate to serve the stability and reproduction of whiteness as a structure and space of power. In mapping these divergent and colliding understandings of public schools, I use the term partition publics to follow how the setup of choice can help us think about rights, belonging, and inequality in the public in a way that normalizes market logics, for example, assuming that there's always going to be some winners and some losers, and the question is only about managing the percentage, or engendering competition and consumership that normalizes exclusion, even when such processes are couched in the language of equity, rights, and care. And perhaps most significantly, shrinking our social relations and political imaginations when it comes to imagining what collective life can be. And it's this last bit that I want to leave us with tonight. It's interesting that you quote CRL James. Selma James offers a provocation that it's not just that the personal is political, but also that the political shapes our personal lives and gives structure to our social relations. And I'll add to the shape and the space of care. And while care was something that was referenced unsurprisingly in all of the interviews I conducted with parents, regardless of their disposition, it became clear that people were talking about really different things. And that, too, to some degree, is not surprising. But what was telling was that on one hand, care was mobilized to make, justify, or rationalize differential rights claims that choice engendered. So in other words, some parents simply cared right, more, or differently, or their priorities or approaches to pedagogy were distinct. These mobilizations of care work to obscure power relations and the violence of racialized exclusion, but also work to ever shrink the space of relationality in a world structured by racial capitalism and increasing instability and precarity, often marked by anxiety, stress, and uncertainty. And here, the logic of choice makes it seem that the only response is to find the right solution for your family. On the other hand, the women at the Head Start Center, an intergenerational community of caregivers bounded by income and geography, where choice was understood to be a setup, not only recognized such solutions to be often unavailable, but they also understood them to be harmful and dangerous. And with this recognition, the space of care, of social relations constructed and reconstructed daily, expanded instead of contracted, to forge practices and infrastructures of radical care work that I believe we can learn a lot from when we think about the what of the public and what beyond the confines of choice and the violence of the continuance of liberal reform. And that's not to say it was a happy model or perfect community. There is no such thing. But it is to say that the practices of care forged through this and many other everyday spaces that make up the marginalized exclusions that choice and more generally racial capitalism require are not merely reactive. Rather, they can be understood as provisional structures of grounded collective knowledge production, survivance, and expanded possibility. They are not novel or new, but reflective of long traditions of Black freedom struggles and the sensibilities generated there that can guide the radical reimagining of our relations towards a clear vision of what the public and more generally what collective life might be.
On March 19, 1935, Harlem exploded. This story is, for the most part, well known. Lino Rivera, a 16-year-old Afro-Puerto Rican, while browsing in the S.H. Crest dime store, saw a penknife that he coveted, and he took it. The police responded violently, not only to the Black folk in the department, but also the passersby that asked about Rivera's welfare and whereabouts. This uproar jump-started what has been called the Harlem Riot of 1935. In response to the riot, LaGuardia created a biracial commission, but he never released the report to the public. Because of this, the New York Amsterdam News, a black weekly, published a draft of the riot in its July 19, 1936 issue, asserting that it was, quote, too hot, too caustic, too critical for LaGuardia to release it. The commission called for civilian intervention. This was the progenitor of the Civilian Complaint Review Board, but also municipal support for housing, jobs, and education. During this year between the start of the investigation and the Black Weekly publishing the draft of the report, white Harlemites used riot as a means to criminalize the entire black community and made demands for more police. For over a year, a large presence of police remained in Harlem. Throughout that year, Harlemites complained about the police. The New York Amsterdam News wrote, quote, the concentration of policemen who feel free to be both judge and officer cannot contribute toward peace. An armed camp is almost certain to become a battleground. One black Harlemite wrote to the Black Weekly calling for the community to protest, quote, the presence of what can be called a police army of occupation for which I can see no real necessity. So when I was doing research for the book, and I'm like, this is weird, well, it's not weird, but I was surprised because this is the language that black power activists used in the 1960s. And so this is the language that was being used in the 1930s, shortly after the Harlem Renaissance. And so this history was deep to me because I grew up in Harlem, not too far from here, near, I think it's called Marcus Garvey Park, but we called it something else back in the day. So between the 1935 and 1943 uprisings, black New Yorkers continued to complain about police brutality. Additionally, the Great Depression, but also World War II conditions contributed to an increase in juvenile crime. And this happened across the country and also in England. So the case that I began with in my initial comments happened in November 1941, and that case precipitated a moral panic among white New Yorkers, incited by the mainstream press, the NYPD, and citizens themselves. The mainstream press here was pivotal in associating the word mugger with Negro. Thus, the black press, black leaders, and civilians organized against police brutality, but also the mainstream press equating the terms muggers with black youth, similar to how our former president and others are associating eating all the things in Ohio with Haitians. The result was an increase of police across the city, mainly in Harlem and Bedford-Stuyvesant, which was then called Little Harlem. In the mayor's records, I found letters from white New Yorkers, but also from black New Yorkers complaining about the failure of the police to protect them, despite visible expansion of the police. Again, so the presence of the police did not mean protection. And so therefore, they were victims of police brutality and the absence of protection, right? So one letter writer referencing this problem asserted, quote, it's my belief that the officers are aware of these conditions, but do nothing about it. They all neglected their duty. So the significance here is that the black community waged a three-pronged war against police brutality, the mainstream press, and crime, right? So in my concluding thoughts slide, oh, forgot about that picture. So that's me at the Boys Club on, I think it's 100 and, where's the Boys Club? It's on the east side, I can't remember. So it's a long, long, long time ago, sorry. Well, no, you know, that was my little hip hop pose. So that was in the 80s, a long time ago for some of us. So do the police make us safe? So I was a fan of, or still am, not was, martial arts films. And so I made some nunchucks out of broom handles. And so, and so my mother called the police because for her, she thought the police would just take the nunchucks from me. Instead, the police hit me with the baton. That picture, I'm maybe 13 years old. My mother passed away when I was 12. So I looked sort of like that, and of course I had hair, so I like the picture. Slide. So I'm gonna skip some of this stuff. So I could not have written this book without the wisdom and teaching of my grand aunt, known famously among my closest and oldest friends as Aunt Rose. She taught me about the politics of safety. I spent maybe thousands of hours watching various police shows with her, from Matlock to Law and Order. Aunt Rose and I loved crime procedurals, and she had all kinds of comments about the criminal behavior in policing. She also loved to read the newspapers. She read the New York Amsterdam News, the New York Daily News, the New York Times, Essence Magazine, she read quite a bit, and she was probably reading, and I think there's coffee. Tea, actually, that was her thing. I would drink coffee. So in 1986, we talked about the killing of Michael Griffith and Howard Beach, and the criminalization of now the exonerated 5 in 1989 and 1990. She had these talks with me not to politicize me, but because she was concerned about my safety from police and crime. Our conversations have remained with me and shaped the writing of the book. She also modeled for me how Black people have always taken it upon themselves to organize for self-protection. I recall one summer in the early 1990s when I returned from college, she asked me to join her and some tenants, mainly a group of elderly Black women and men, to monitor the people coming in and out of our building. After I left Harlem, I moved to the South Bronx and Mount Haven public housing, so this is where I'm talking about. Their goal was to respond to the negligence of the police despite their huge presence in the South Bronx, and to hopefully reduce the number of people frequenting the building, engaging in criminal activities in the hallways and staircases. They also had a symbolic function as a symbol of protection, safety, and community responsibility. While I didn't know it at the time, Aunt Rose and the tenants were teaching me that more police did not necessarily mean more safety, especially if you're Black and brown, and that we as a community had to come up with alternative strategies and solutions to our safety. Thank you. Next slide. There it is.
Yeah. So this is the moment when we open it up for questions, for comments, so that we can kind of talk together about what we've heard.
Mm-hmm. So we got 2 mics, right? So you can line up at the mic and pose your question.
Mm-hmm. Oh, and this is Kamosi Woodard.
Co-founder
Co-founder
of Conversations.
We want to limit the profanity because I turn pink if you use bad words.
No lightning. No lightning round? I'm heartbroken.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, because of this light, I can't see you, so you can go ahead and ask your question.
Well, thank you for that. It was awesome, and people all over this country need to learn this kind of thing. we're in a serious emergency now, and it seems to me there's kind of these two battles. One is the racists who are shouting it from the rooftops, who are proud of it, and one is the people who may even think of themselves as liberals who reinforce structural racism and don't challenge it. So how do we deal with those two distinct groups in organizing and public education?
Do we want to take a few, or?
No, why don't we,
Okay.
anybody can.
I'll jump in, and maybe others can as well. Thank you for that question. I think it's an important one. And I think this moment, as you say, kind of makes it feel like those spaces are very far apart. But I think one of the things that, again, I learned through the seminar you all convened, and that I found through both the organizing and the research, is that they're not so far apart, right? And so, as I think you know in your comment as well, so I think we do have to then think about what is it infrastructure, the actual infrastructure we're trying to defend in the moment, and how do we also work to transform it, right? Because the status quo of just maintaining is a violence, as you say, and I think you were pointing to in your comment question, but I think also it is about then from whose perspective are we thinking about the transformation? Do we begin it? Do we think about it? And I think there's so much we can learn historically around the unfinished struggles that we then can consider ourselves continuing today.
Anybody else want to jump in?
Other thoughts?
I think that was great.
Next question.
Yeah, it's wonderful to see friends up on the stage. My question, since several other presentations dealt with police brutality and police violence, wondering what were some of the more radical strategies that people were talking about in the periods that you're writing about? Were they talking about abolition back then? You know, obviously Civilian Complaint Review Board, you know, one of the reform strategies, but what were some perhaps more radical strategies to combat police brutality were your activists talking about?
I'll begin. So in the 1930s, a civilian review board was radical, right? And basically what happened is that Police Commissioner Valentine completely rejected the commission's recommendations. So although the commission was never publicly released, since it was printed in the newspaper, everyone knew about it, and they continued to try to pressure LaGuardia to implement some of the recommendations. And so the idea of civilians playing any role in the police department was viewed as radical. And so part of the history that we know is really not until the 1960s, in the case of New York, and I think you actually read about some of this in your work, do we get the Civilian Review Board. And then, as you know, that was defaced, right? So in the case of the 30s and 40s, it was considered radical.
I would just add to that, Chris, and take the liberty to kind of shift your question a little to talk about the present and in terms of policing. Since the Civilian Review Board was first introduced in Rochester in 1963, and in the wake of the 1964 uprising, the police union there, which not coincidentally is called the Locust Club, after the locust wood that is used to make their nightsticks, or was in 1902 when they formed, has actively advocated against any type of civilian review for the past 60 years. The work that I'm doing right now sort of traces this 60-year history where the police unions have only gathered more money, more power, and more control over their reign of terror, quite honestly. discipline, which used to reside in the hands of the police chief, who was overseen by city council, who were elected by the citizens, just simply does not exist in the same ways anymore. Discipline is now bargained for collectively through these agreements that they rewrite every 3 or 4 years. It is virtually impossible in the city of Rochester to hold a police officer accountable for murdering somebody in the streets. If you are hearing the agony in my voice, it is because since 2020, when Daniel Prude was killed in the streets, the Rochester police have killed 13 more people. This year, they have killed 5. 20% of all of the people killed in New York State by police, 25% of it is happening in Rochester, New York. They are under siege, and they need help, just like they did in 1964. They need national attention, and they need the support of other communities in this battle. It's a crisis. It's a crisis.
I would add, if I could, so Detroit, police in Detroit were incredibly murderous and bloodthirsty. And there were a number of moments of really extraordinary mass violence on the part of Detroit police towards all kinds of activist groups, but particularly the Republic of New Africa, the Poor People's Campaign, and a number of other groups. So there's sort of nothing that Detroiters didn't try, right? They did lawsuits, they did petitioning, they worked collectively to sort of go to the city council. Sometimes they went undercover to watch the testing of new weapons that the police were gonna get, right? So that they could expose and try to push against that. But one of the kind of largest efforts that I look at in the book is what I think is the only all-white cop-watching group that I know of in the Black Power era. And they develop a system to cover the entire city with white cop watchers, with the idea that white eyes really matter on police, right? And they parallel the League of Revolutionary Black Workers and Ken Cockrell and his kind of radical law firm at the time. And they sort of barely make a dent, but there is really kind of nothing that Detroiters don't try because the police violence is so bad.
Hello, good evening. Thank you all for coming to share your research. I am curious, knowing that majority of your work is in the North and in North, right? What about the West? And so I'm just trying to figure out, like, have you guys had any type of finding, any research on the West? And the reason why I'm asking, I'm born and raised, I'm from California. And so being from California, we have a nickname for the officers. We call it one time, because you got one time to get it right. If they come back, they gonna kill you. And so some of what you got to talk about, like in the 60s, like, yeah, like the Watts riots, that was because of the police killing, an altercation with the LAPD. I'm from San Diego, so it's the same thing at San Diego Police Department. They have had some, I guess I could say issues with the Black community, but nonetheless, I'm just curious that you guys are talking about the North. Have you guys had any findings specifically on the West Coast? Because how I see it, as long, like Malcolm said, as long as you're south of the Canadian border, you're born south. So, right. I'm curious, have you had any findings, mainly with the West Coast, or any like correlation, like, oh wow, this was going on in California at the same time this was going on in Rochester or Detroit, et cetera? I'm just curious.
It's a great question. Our seminar that we've all referenced tonight really included a number of scholars who were working on the West Coast. Your question makes me think of Aliyah Dunn Salahidin, who was writing on the uprising that happened in San Francisco. And she really does trace the police brutality, and I would expect her work to be coming out very soon on that.
Hi.
Hi.
My name is James, and this question is for Say, if I said your name correctly.
Yeah.
First, thank you for your extemporaneous presentation. I appreciate that very much. First, let me preface my question with a brief statement. I was born in 1972 in Manhattan. My mother was born in Detroit in 1939, and my grandmother was born in the Carolinas in 1920, but raised in Detroit. My question is, in light of the myths surrounding race relations, particularly but not limited to Detroit, what implications and ramifications do you see as it applies to present-day organizing on the precipice of the presidential election next month?
Wow, thank you so much. What a great question. So what I would say is, can I talk about 2020 for a second to answer this? I think we saw post sort of 2017 Trumpism, but especially post 2020, a sort of re-rise of this idea that white people should be organizing other white people against racism in a way that really, to me, sort of shows that racially parallel organizing is a really powerful legacy of the Black Power movement, really broadly speaking. And one of the things that I'd really like organizers and those of us who are politically engaged today to think about is not to think about that as a method of identity politics, because I think it waters that notion down, and it sort of does some of that work around the myth of Black Power that was there to begin with, which was this idea that it was all this ideological drive, this ideological hatred of white people, when really this is a strategy, it's a tactic. It's born out of these on-the-ground trial and error efforts to see what will work. So to the extent that racially parallel organizing might help us today to have these kinds of racialized divisions of labor around the election or around any other issues, right? We have to understand it as one strategy, not the ends, but one means to an end. So that's what I would say for today. Yeah.
Hi, so my name is Giselle Hearn, and I'm a resident of Harlem, been born and bred here all my life, 63 years, and things have gotten from bad to worse, in my time, and just watching a lot of, honestly, I'm afraid to send my kids outside, my grandson outside to play, to ride his bike, because, kids is going outside and they're not coming home, So, we had a politician, a councilwoman. Her name was Kristen Richardson Jordan, and she ran on socialism, right? She believed that we could one day achieve abolition. We can have a world without cops and jails, and we still stand on that belief today. So, along with my friend here, Sahani, and my sister right there, Tanisha, raise your hand, there has been an organization called
the New York City Abolition and Education Justice Working Group. We've been doing community conversations.
Is there a question coming?
Yes, there is.
All right.
We've been doing conversations across boroughs around abolition, around the idea and experiences of how we keep each other safe. I know you mentioned, Dr. King, around the work of communities and keeping each other safe is long ongoing, it's nothing new. And so I think that's something that I wanted to ask you about too, of what were some of those examples, right? You did mention the Commission Review Board, but in community, what were some of the examples of, right, how are people taking care of each other? How are people keeping each other safe? Because we are trying to continue that work today, right?
And I also just wanted to say, no, it wasn't really your question. It's just that we need people to understand and know that the work is still going on. Like, we are still doing these type of things here in our community. We want to make the people here in this room aware that there are groups out here fighting for community when it comes to police brutality and abolition. So thank you with that.
Thank you.
Did anybody want
All right, Harlem. Yes, so thank you for letting us know, and I would love if you have any information or anything to hand out that you would do so at the end. So part of what I was getting at is that in Harlem and Bedford-Stuyvesant, Black communities were doing a range of things. In some cases, they were conservative, which would be trying to send the kids to church, right? In other cases, they were inviting police officers to schools. But in other cases, they were going to the police departments and demanding protection. They also began to organize their own sort of parent responsibility committees. So there were a range of strategies that they used at the time. Again, this is the 1930s and 40s. And so part of the takeaway from me was that within the context of both police brutality and the absence of protection, that the Black community was thinking about alternative strategies in the 30s and 40s, and we can look at other scholars who talk about this occurring much earlier. And so to me, that is important for your message precisely because we can say that when we focus on reform, we can say we've done that already, right? We can sort of move on to alternative strategies and investing in Black communities who are thinking about more creative ways of protection, right? And so we know that across the country, there are various cities, including our own, or I'm still a Harlemite, but I don't live here, but in places like Queens or in Atlanta and other places, they're creating cop cities. Mm-hmm. And we know that there's lots and lots of investment in the cities for policing and for what, right? And they're not doing much. Mm-hmm. And so what if that money was invested in other ways of thinking about protection, right? And that's really that's really the sort of huge takeaway for me, which is that we can sort of think about the 1960s to the present, but we can also go much further back and see ways where people were thinking about these issues precisely because the police failed to protect them.
Yeah, hello, thank you. I loved everything I was just hearing, but I want to pick up the book, Unsettling Choice, but I want to know, do you highlight the fact that how even though that during the 60s, because I'm trying to get up to 40s, during the 60s when, during the civil rights movement, during the 60s, that us trying to work with all the other groups deterred off of basically what the Black movement was trying to do?
Is that?
I think it's for you.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, so thank you for the question.
Maybe you could restate the question a little.
I'm not, could you restate the question, please?
I was saying that I want to pick up your book, but I'm just asking, do you highlight in the book anywhere that the fact that us collaborate with some of these groups, not working in parallel, took away from what Black people was doing at the time?
Yes, yeah, I think, so one of the things I'm trying to look at is following on one hand, thank you for restating it, and for the question. I think one of the things on one hand I'm trying to look at is how in the post-Brown period, right, choice kind of followed a trajectory of pushing back against, right, very radical and bold demands being made by Black communities and Latinx communities, right, together, sometimes and separately sometimes, for a much bolder, bigger vision, right, and how choice would often come in to curtail that. And kind of push back on that through idea of individual rights and individual choices. I think the other thing we can learn a lot from also is that, this is a work that you all highlight also in Freedom North, is the histories of the Harlem Nine here in Harlem, right? And how women and entire communities organized, again, for not for integration, right, but for a desegregation of public schooling, right, and for the choice to be able to send their kids to schools that they thought could actually serve them. So looking at kind of that tension of how those demands, how that vision was consistently pushed back, and one of the mechanisms that did that was choice. Thank you. Okay, thanks.
Hello. First, I want to thank God and my ancestors for getting us all here safely. Pray we all get back safely also. And thanks for this conversation. I'm Carl Bledsoe Jr. I'm from Memphis, just visiting, but I'm a Africana scholar back from home. That's what I got my major and degree in last year.
Congratulations.
And thank you. Oh, yes.
Welcome, Memphis, Tennessee.
I have 2 questions. I'm also an artist, and I've struggled trying to find the middle ground between my passion for Black history and Black people and telling Black stories and my artistry. So how do y'all see the role of artists in this struggle right now, in the present day? And then 2, just what's next for y'all straight up? I'm just looking.
That's a great question. I think, unfortunately, it's going to be our last question, so maybe everybody can take both in terms of art, but also where you're going next would be great.
Sure.
There it is. So yeah, I would say the same thing. I mean, I think poetry, music, art, theater is important. Last night I went to see Michelle Indegocello in Fairfield, and the album is incredible. I hadn't listened to much of it before I went to the concert, but it's organized around James Baldwin's writings, right? And so, and as she was playing the music, as the band was playing the music, she was also reading parts of his work, but also sort of introducing other artists through it, right? So I think there's always this important tie, and of course we have Harlem Renaissance, Black Arts Movement, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's really important for you that there are many examples and models for you to proceed to make that connection. I have a few different ideas about book projects, but one of them is sort of thinking about Harlem in the 1920s and bringing that history to the present and sort of interrogating how the idea of Harlem has changed over time from this idea of Harlem as a Negro Mecca to whatever it is now.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think it's so important. I think, in work, in whatever we're trying to build, we need artists. And I think they can't be, I've been part of organizing work in the past where it's like, oh, okay, then you have an artist committee, right? People are invited to kind of come and maybe decorate things or do things, right? And I think part of what we miss through that kind of formulation is we need artists to be everywhere, right? We need artists in the mix as thinkers, as intellectuals, as cultural workers, as organizers to help really expand our political imagination. The cover of my book is a dear friend and kind of co-traveler, interlocutor, who we've been part of lots of different organizing work together. Her name is Mildred Beltre, and part of that work is part of a series called What is to be Built. And so part of what she investigates through that series is part of what I'm trying to think about through my written work, right? And through other work that I do. So I think just it's really important to think about Robin Kelly refers to this as a poetic knowledge that we build through organizing work, but also through collective dreaming and the radical imagination. So I think we need artists as part of everything we do, and it's really critical. In terms of my next project, one thing I'm trying to work on is look at a few case studies from the late 60s and early 1970s of organizing through education in New York City around kind of street academies to food distribution programs, but really look at how, so it's provisionally called Education Against Enclosure, and it's really looking at how people, the kind of epistemology, the form of knowledge production built within the space of enclosure that made people try out some really powerful experiments, but also reach beyond just the sector of education. So there's one case study that's the Academy for Black and Latin Education, where they, before the Young Lords, but Iris Morales was part of it, they did occupy a hospital, right? So it was before the occupation of Lincoln Hospital. And thinking about how this expansive vision for kind of cross-sectoral organizing in a city takes shape.
I don't think I can wax poetic about art, except to say in the darkest moments of the movement, in the darkest moments of organizing, it is only art that feeds people's souls. It's absolutely critical. I'm working on two kind of related projects simultaneously. I am working on a book about a Rochester woman named Betty Tyson, who was wrongfully convicted of murdering a Xerox executive in 1973, beaten during her interrogation by an investigator named Backroom Bill for his ability to secure confessions. She spent 25 years at Bedford Hills. She was the longest serving woman inmate when she was exonerated in 1998. And she just passed away about a year ago. So I'm using her story to kind of uncover this history of policing in Rochester, and in particular, the ways in which Black women are demonized and sort of discarded in our narratives about policing. Certainly not the first person to do this. There's been lots of work around this of late, but I think her story will really add something to that conversation. And I continue to work on this issue of policing and police unions and the role that collective bargaining has played in removing transparency and accountability both from the purview of the public. I think there's a lot of activist work to be done around that.
Thank you so much for your question. It's making me think about the organizing circles that I'm in and the lack of opportunities we create for artists to make the work fly, to be honest. I think about the activists that I study from Detroit, and they had people who drew cartoons, who did guerrilla theater, who wrote poetry, and you would see all of this in action, you'd see all this in their newsletters. And I do abolitionist and bail fund organizing where I live in Pennsylvania, and I am so embarrassed to say you have really made me think about what opportunities we have or haven't created for people. So I really appreciate that, and I'm gonna think more about that as I go home. The next work that I'm working on is trying to ask two questions. How did the state weaponize the criminal legal system to stymie Black freedom efforts in the 1960s and 70s? And how did the people build movements to take on their criminalization? So it's gonna look at a whole host of different things, including some of the first community-run bail funds, running radical people for judgeships, developing people's law firms. And I don't know how I'm gonna wrangle my hands around it, but I'm really, really excited about the project.
Can I say something on the art thing?
Yes, please do.
Yeah. Part of racial oppression, capitalism, racism, the whole 9 yards, is many of our people, and not just our people, have a difficult time reading. So when we were doing our newspaper, we always had artists to try to render visually what the article was saying in the newspaper, right? So that's kind of important role. I think artists are so basic to organizing. If you're doing organizing without artists, you're probably not organizing too many people, right? So to help, but also this issue of visualizing the alternative, right? Imagination is fueled by images, right? What does it look like? What is an alternative? What does liberation look like? Right? What Larry Neal's phrase was, visions of a liberated future. We need that. We need that.
That was perfect.
Yeah. Thank you so much, everyone, our panelists. Thank you for Kamosi Woodard for coming and helping us bring all these voices into the room. Thank you, our audience in this room with us today in Harlem and online and wherever you are in the world. It's been an amazing conversation. I feel the emotional weight of the ongoing struggle, as well as just the power of this long history of resistance that you all so beautifully render. I just wanted to note that we'll be back on November 7th online. Our topic is Black History, Anti-Colonialism, and Global Revolution. We'll have scholars Natanya Duncan, Monique Badass, Kito Swan, and Paula Marie Seniors online. So we want everyone to tune in to that. And of course, you can see it all at blackfreedomstudies.org. And please do follow us at Schomburg CBFS. Thank you.
We don't think so.